All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. Today, we're going to go into our workshop of how to nail your next interview. And I'm going to share screen and we will jump right in here. Okay, so we'll do from beginning. Be all set. All right, perfect. Thank you, everyone, for being here today again. My name is Christina Cardona. I am the coordinator for internships and career programming for Rockefeller College, and we will jump right in. Okay. So some of the things that we will cover during this workshop are laid out, not all of them, but we'll be going into some of our best interviewing strategies, additional interviewing best strategies. What should you do during an interview and what should you not do during an interview? Preparing for success, some common interview questions, the STAR technique, using the STAR technique, common interview formats, and more. Okay, so some basic interviewing basics and tips. So you've already submitted your resume, you've already submitted your cover letter and any other application materials. With that being said, the interview is likely the first time you're really interacting with the interviewer or the employer in person or virtually. So you really want to make a great first impression. And that being said, you want to be professional, you want to be enthusiastic, really showing that you want to be there. And with that being said, there's a few things that are like cornerstones of making a great first impression. So that being said, arriving early, making sure you're not just on time, but you're early. Usually about 10 to 15 minutes is a great marker. So that being said, making sure you're prepared. You've got your resume with you, you've got your cover letter just as a copy, as a to refer to if you need a pen, a notebook, or a pad folio to take notes during the interview or to ask questions and make notes of things that are discussed. And also just having the job description handy can also be really helpful as well. Smile, convey a positive tone, kind of goes hand in hand with showing enthusiasm. This is really important because, again, they want to see that you really want to be there. And your entire attitude, your demeanor, how you're presenting yourself is what is being presented to them and will show them if you're really interested in this position and in having the conversation with them. That being said, remembering that it is a two-way conversation and that you really want to remember it is not just them interviewing you, it's also you interviewing them. And that being said, and we'll go more into depth with questions after, but when you're asking questions, making sure that these questions are intentional to see if you also think they would be a good fit for you too. And that being said as well, just being authentic. Of course, it's very common. Everybody gets nervous before an interview, but making sure that you're presenting the best version of yourself. You're authentic, you're still yourself, even though you're professional and displaying a positive attitude. You want to make sure that you're also not presenting a false version of yourself either, because they'll see right through that, and your answers will also just not be as authentic, and you'll be doing yourself a disservice if you're not showing who you really are in the interview. Okay, so next question are what are your best interviewing strategies? So if anybody would like to participate for that, feel free. All right, so we will move on from that to some of the best strategies I would recommend. So that being said, being intentional when answering interview questions, as I mentioned before, really stop and think about what's being asked of you and taking the time to answer all parts of the question. So sometimes in an interview, there might be a multiple part question. They might ask you, for example, tell me 3 times, or not even just in a behavioral question, because I'd like to talk more about that later. But for example, say they ask you to go through a certain skill or a procedure or something you have done, and then follow it up with like what you learned or how it's relevant to their organization or something related to that. Just again, making sure that you are answering all parts of the question to show that you're paying attention and that you want to give them the most thorough answer possible too. Nonverbal communication, that's things like not just being enthusiastic and conveying a smile, but also maintaining good eye contact, not checking your phone. That's a big no, like not seeming distracted, doing other things. Keeping in mind that an interview typically is a pretty short portion of time. And that being said, you should be able to focus and also be present during that time because again, it's your first impression. You want to make a good one. Another helpful tip too is if you're in the job search process, you're interviewing with a bunch of different places or organizations, and you want to keep track of who you're interviewing with, people's, titles or positions at the organizations, etc. It can be helpful even during the interview. You don't have to do it, as they're asking you the question, for example, and if it distracts you, but if you can make a quick note of the names of the people that are interviewing you, and then also referring to them by name throughout the rest of the interview or in your follow-up email to show that you're not only paying attention, but to show your interest and your commitment to obtaining that, obtaining your goal of a position in their organization. So, as I keep mentioning, paying attention when it comes to asking questions at the end, if you talked in depth about the workplace culture, for example, of the organization throughout the interview, and then you ask, what is your company's workplace culture like? The employer or the interviewers might think, okay, that's a little odd. That's what we went over for a while. So that being said, don't just have one question prepared. I typically will have anywhere in between 3 to 5 questions for myself. That being said, if you want to prepare more, 6 to 8 is always a good range as well, just to play it safe in case your questions are answered, but you still want to be prepared with more questions to show your interest is really important. So those are some more best strategies. What should you not do during an interview is our next question. Okay, so here are some tips for that. Being late is never a good idea. As I mentioned, arriving 10 to 15 minutes early is always a very safe time frame, if you will. So being late, even being right on time, it's really best to be early, but being late especially is a big no because it shows that you're not prepared, even if you were, but something happened. For example, you got stuck in traffic or your car broke down or anything like that. All of those things, even though everybody is human and they do happen, before an interview is definitely the time to do to the best of your ability, the best you can with making sure that you don't run into any snags, if you will, during that time. Say normally it takes you an hour or a half hour to get to the organization or the company's place, like just giving yourself extra time, maybe not relying on public transportation, getting dropped off by a trusted friend, anything like that to ensure your timeliness for the interview is really important. Also, keeping in mind, even though an interview is a two-way conversation and it shouldn't be so formal that it is only the interviewer asking you questions and you feel like it is more of less of a conversation, because it is, of course, it's an interview, but it is also a conversation. That's how a good interview should feel, is that it's not a conversation with a close friend or, a family member or something like that. So you really need to keep in mind being appropriate, being professional, recognizing the context and the environment of where you are, and that the information being shared should be appropriate. It should be professional. There shouldn't be cursing. There shouldn't be slang used. It should more just be a polite, professional conversation. You don't have to be a robot, but you also should talk in a way where you're sharing what's relevant to the interview, but not unnecessary personal details. Anything that's not related to the interview really is always important. Also, going off of that, with appropriateness is dressing inappropriately. It's always recommended to dress professionally, dress conservatively, wear a suit, wear a black, gray, or navy. We always recommend those colors just as those are standard, professional, clean looking colors, and also just showing that you're prepared, but you're not wearing a very flashy outfit or jewelry that's distracting or perfume that's like unsettling or anything that could be distracting. That's why we, again, recommend wearing pretty solid colors and also dressing professionally. Again, wearing a suit, having a briefcase, having a bag that is not, there's not papers falling out of it, for example, having like a professional bag where you've got what you need. It shows that you're prepared and it shows that you want to dress for the job. And that being said, even for video interviews, it's always recommended to still dress professionally even if you don't have a full suit on, if you have your suit or like a blazer on the top, I still would not recommend wearing pajama pants on the bottom because let's say you spill a glass of water or you need to get up. It's going to be embarrassing if you show that that's what you're wearing on the bottom. So you could always wear, like, say you don't want to wear a full suit, you could wear dress pants or something like that on the bottom. And another thing recommended not to do during an interview, kind of going off the notion of what's appropriate to discuss. Discussing salary, that could be a discussion for a later time, generally not during the first interview as you're still getting to know each other. And time off. That's also something that can be brought up later if you need a specific time frame off and you want to make sure that is okay with your employer, but not appropriate to discuss during the first round interview, as that's not really the purpose of this conversation. Also, a big no is being negative. If you start discussing how you really didn't like your previous supervisor, you really hated the company you work for currently, or that you just ended working for, that's not the best look for you, or just showing that you have, you know, everybody's not going to see eye to eye all the time, which is okay, but there's always a way you can do that if they ask you directly about, which they likely won't, but if they do ask why you have left your previous position, you can always say something more like you were looking for a new opportunity or you were looking for more experience or a position in X field that's relevant, rather than focusing on the personal attributes of the company or the suit or a supervisor, for example, because it just shows that you're willing to kind of share this information and you don't really care how this looks. You want to keep a positive tone overall. Okay, so moving on here. Preparing for success. So before the interview, some things you could do to really just make yourself stand out and to show your preparation is researching the organization, the company, the interviewers, exactly what you're applying for. Looking up the people on LinkedIn. Say you've been presented with a list of who is interviewing or who you are interviewing with. It's always good to be familiar with their titles, their positions, so that you know their role in interviewing you, but then also how you would fit into this organization and ensuring, would this be a good fit for me? Are these types of positions that people I'd be working with, does this make sense for me? Is this the type of position I am really interested in? And doing that research, usually on their website, usually under the contact us or the about section or career section on a company's website, can be great places to look. Also, as we discussed with questions before, preparing questions ahead of time and having them with you for the interview. Of course, if questions pop up after the interview or during the interview that you want to save to the end that you hadn't prepared, that have kind of come about as a result of the conversation, that's great. But that being said, still having your set questions, because maybe things didn't come up that are different from what you had previously prepared, or you just want to have multiple questions. So that doesn't mean you have to ask them 10 questions and have the question portion be an extra hour of the interview, for example. Typically, interviewers have limited time, but they do still want to give you the opportunity to ask questions at the end. So that being said, still having at least a few questions prepared that are relevant and that you're sure are what you really want to ask intentionally for the position. Also, practicing your elevator pitch or your tell me about yourself question. We have a sample that I'll go over, but this is really focused on the initial introduction of and this is why you're not going to ask about, for example, like salary or time off, because they still want to get to know you, right? So they're going to start it off with, tell me about yourself. This will very most likely happen during your interview before they dive into more skills-based questions or behavioral questions. So that being said, practicing a sample answer for this that isn't too long, but also isn't just your name, for example, is really important. We'll go into depth with this in a second too. But also just being prepared for common interview questions and preparing sample answers. So that being said, I've provided some common interview questions in the PowerPoint, but that being said, preparing, it doesn't have to be like full answers written out, but even some bullet points for these questions so that you know you've got your stock answers of what you can discuss rather than having to think about them on the spot, which can be very stressful and nerve-wracking. So even though you might not know every single question they ask, the questions will likely vary or be very similar to the two common interview questions related so that you can kind of at least pull from what you've prepared ahead of time and then weave that within the common interview questions, if that makes sense. Any questions? Okay, so moving on. So furthermore, before we talk about some of the other things I mentioned, we'll go more into depth with. Another thing you can do to prepare for success before the interview is evaluating your skills and experience again. And that can still be related to your resume, your cover letter. You've probably already done this, but still making sure to have these documents handy, whether it's on your computer, whether it's printed, whatever the case it may be. List of qualifications, the job description, job responsibilities. And that doesn't mean, as we've discussed with cover letters, for example, that everything has to be an exact match, but also just remembering that you're going to want to talk about what's really relevant to the position. You definitely have skills that may not be used or are less important for this role, which are still great to have on a resume or to include or discuss more in a different job interview. But that being said, you really want to emphasize why you would be the best fit for the role, given your background and experience. And that's why we always talk about tailoring your resume and cover letter to specific positions so that they can see you really would be the best fit rather than just looking at all of your skills and, having it be more general. And that being said, you might not have extensive work experience, for example, but maybe you have transferable research skills from a class you've taken, and research is a very important part of the job position that's been laid out. So don't forget about these transferable skills. I would also recommend, and we do have the interviewing handbook linked at the end of the PowerPoint, but looking at the key skill sets section of the interviewing handbook, because these are skills that you might have transferable skills that you're not as familiar with, or you haven't realized how important they are yet, but really taking the time to reflect on what could be used to the best of your benefit, really, for interviewing or for interviews is a really great step to take in your preparation process. Okay, so as we've discussed, common interview questions. So we've already gone over, tell me about yourself, but we do have a sample answer for that too. A few other possible common interview questions could be, what accomplishment are you most proud of? This could be, for example, something related to the position, something that could be a relevant accomplishment. Let's say it was I know I mentioned research before, but it could be a research project you did, and research might be a really important part of this role. So highlighting that would be really relevant. But you could also mention something unrelated, but something I would still recommend that ties into your transferable skills or your specific attributes as a candidate. Maybe not something that you might not want to say something like when you were 10 years old, you hit a home run, for example. That might not be as relevant unless you want to, talk about how that accomplishment had shown your teamwork and your work ethic and relate that to how you've carried that throughout your, your life and your professional life, etc. But you see what I mean for that? Okay, so another example of a question is, how do you work as part of a team? This question could be posed as either a how question, which keeping in mind you don't want it to be a yes or no answer. You want to really think about, they're probably asking when they phrase it like this, is what type of team player are you? Are you more of an independent player, if you will? Are you someone that, gets a lot done, but isn't as like vocal or the loudest person on the team, for example? Are you somebody that's the organizer? Are you somebody that's more behind the scenes? These are all ways you could tackle this question. This could also be asked or posed as a behavioral question, such as like, tell me about a time you worked as part of a team. And they might provide more detail, accompanying that. But that being said, you really just want to keep highlighting your skills, whether those are relevant skills, transferable skills, or both. They want to see how your past experience has taken you both to the present and will take you to the future and make you a suitable candidate for their organization. Another example of a possible common interview question is, what interests you most about our organization and company? This is something you could touch on in the tell me about yourself question, but if they ask it more about, why, this is still begging the question of why you. Why are you interested? What has stood out to you about our organization? And this is kind of a test in that they want to see how much research has this person done. And keep in mind, they don't expect you to know every single thing about their organization or company. But let's say, for example, you refer to a key portion or a key part of their organization, but you've actually referred to a different organization. Like, they're going to see, okay, this person has just been interviewing in so many different places or at so many different places, and it's not clear that you really want them. You're really interested in them. So, for example, you could say something like, I noticed that on your website, your mission statement is really well accompanied with your projects. And I saw examples of team projects that have been posted to your website. I would really be interested in joining or collaborating on these projects. And I would love if this would be part of, you could even pose it as like a follow-up question too. Like, could this or would this be a part of my position? I'm really intrigued by this factor. So again, just showing that you've taken the time, and it shows effort and preparation as well. And another example of a very common question that it's not always phrased just like this, as what are your strengths and weaknesses? It could be something like, what are you looking to improve on? What are you confident in? Something related. I know strengths and weaknesses is tending to get a little less used now, at least in those exact words. But for strengths and weaknesses, you really just want to make sure you're backing up these questions with facts, evidence, and likely a story. It doesn't have to be a long story. This isn't as much of a behavioral, tell me about a time question. But that being said, you still want to keep in mind that your weaknesses for that question, you don't want to just say, I'm really bad at this, right? You want to talk about, I'm not as confident with this, but I've taken these steps to improve in this area and I've made this progress. Something like that, just really emphasizing that you are you're aware of what you'd like to work on, but you also are, you're able to kind of move forward and you're willing to improve too. It shows commitment, it shows strong work ethics, etc. So, and you can always refer back to these common interview questions in our interviewing handbook, but then also once this presentation is posted as well, you can also refer back to these too. So moving on here. So tell me about yourself sample answer. So this is not a standard for that every single tell me about yourself is going to be exactly this. But for example, hello, my name is X. I have 3 years of experience in campaigning and an undergraduate degree in political science. I'm local to the Albany area, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you today. I'm really passionate about community outreach and local government relevant to X position, which is the position, of course, you would be applying for during this interview. I'm really interested in learning more about your organization. So again, as you see, you can always add more depth to this. This is kind of the bare bones version of this tell me about yourself answer. If your undergraduate degree got you interested in this role or has just encouraged you throughout your work history or your work experience so far, it can be relevant to mention. Talk about your work experience. You can also mention, like I said, I'm local to the Albany area, where you're from. Appreciate your time, expressing gratitude. And you'll always want to do this more so at the end, but it never hurts to do it a little bit at the beginning as well. And always going, as I mentioned before, past, present, and future format. So education can sometimes be in the present, but let's say in this case, you've already received your undergrad degree. You can talk about your education, your current, and this isn't mentioned here, but this is another thing. You could talk about your current experience with work and or an interest you have, whether it's something you've been doing in your current role or you're hoping to gain. And again, this is an elevator pitch. It doesn't have to be a super long answer. It doesn't have to be like, I noticed X, this, and this on your website. You can go more into depth with that throughout the interview, but just bringing it back to why are you here? You want to make sure that this answer is also relevant too. Okay. So as we talked about before, there's different types of common interview questions. An interview question format or type is a behavioral-based question. So behavioral-based questions should be answered using the STAR technique. So that being said, let's try an example together. Tell me about a time you used your organizational skills. So the STAR technique, which S is situation, the background information, T, task, what did you have to do? A, action, what you did and how you did it. And R, result or the outcome of your effort. So if you use STAR in answering these questions, it can definitely make these behavioral, like story-based questions, if you will, much easier to answer and to stay on task. So not to be confused with task as in what did you have to do? But that being said, let's go through an example. So using the STAR technique. So again, the question is, tell me about a time where you used your organizational skills. So the situation, in my introduction to politics class at the University at Albany, the task is I worked in a 4-member group on a case study surrounding the proposed closing of a town park. The action, I took the initiative to serve as team leader of the group, so I organized weekly meetings for the team members to discuss the progress of the project. I made a list of all the necessary components of the case study and delegated each task. I followed up with each team member to clarify responsibilities and ensured that the task was completed in a timely fashion. Finally, I compiled all of the team's components into a written report. The result, the group presented the findings to the class and we received an A on the project. So, as I said before, this is broken down into the situation, task, action, and result. The action and result are always important. I would say arguably more important, but of course you still need the S and the T to kind of set up and provide context for your example. But as you can see in the action, there's examples of how you used your organizational skills. You delegated, you communicated, you followed up, you ensured, you met deadlines, and all of these things plus more just show that this is something you could do in this organization. So that being said, organization is clearly important to the position because that being said, the employer wouldn't just be asking the question just to ask. So you providing a very relevant and concrete example with a driven result is really important for them to see. Okay, so some common interview formats here. So the in-person interview is definitely the most common. Virtual interview is usually the first round interview. Sometimes the in-person interview can be the first round too, but especially say you're not local, you're out of state, sometimes the first round interview will be virtual and then followed up by an in-person interview if they're interested in having you move forward in the interview process. A telephone interview is not as common, but sometimes used as a screening or a first interview, just more of like a get to know you. And then they'll probably have you then do either an in-person or a like video or like a Zoom virtual interview. And a recorded video interview, not as common, but something that sometimes larger organizations will use. And just making sure on that note, and with all of these, but especially just technology in general, is that you want to make sure for video interviews that your setup is prepared ahead of time, that you're in a noise-free environment, there's not clutter around you, you have what you need the same way you would have for an in-person interview, but making sure, especially on a video interview, that the lighting is good. There's not a lot of background noise. It's a non-distracting environment. It's quiet. Again, it's your background. You can also blur. I know I have the Rockefeller background on now, but I could also just blur my background and that would be a non-distracting environment too. So just making sure that you're also just something that might seem self-explanatory, but not always, is that you should be inside. That can definitely help with, as long as it's a more, a quiet environment, but making sure that you're using a computer that you don't have, I said outside also just for like background noise, maybe cars going by if you live in a busy neighborhood, things like that. And just making sure that this is all tested ahead of time, that your Wi-Fi is working and connected, your computer is charged, and that you have what you need so that you feel prepared, and that you're not testing these things out as the interview is happening, because that can be stressful. And then also there might be things that you didn't think about that would be important to have prepared and just, set up ahead of time that you might forget when you're in a more, stressful state of mind. Any questions about that? No? Okay. Okay, so that being said, you really want to make sure you have, as I mentioned before, you have smart, relevant questions ready. So asking questions that you really want the answer to. What would your employees say is the best part of working here? That's a good example of touching on like workplace culture or workplace environment. How would you describe the cycle of work in this department or agency? What has been your favorite project to work on? And this also is you, as I said before, you interviewing them too, in that if they don't have great answers, that will also make you potentially reconsider this organization if they don't have favorite project, if they don't have great things to say, or at least like concrete examples of what the workplace culture or environment is like. Those are things that might be super important to you in your job or your interview process. So if you ask about what type of supervision will I receive, if you're more of an independent thinker or learner or supervisee, if you will, and it seems from their answer that it is more of a, I don't want to say micromanaging because they likely would not say that in the interview, but that being said, if it just from their language, it seems to be an environment that isn't as much of a fit for you and your independent working style, that can also be something to consider too. So definitely, I would recommend in preparing these questions, both some of them are common across the board to lots of different types of positions. But that being said, also looking at the job description, looking at the position responsibilities and qualifications, because that can also help you prepare questions that are relevant and that will likely come up for you throughout this process. So we already talked about this, so we can skip the practice elevator pitch. So dressing professionally, we went over this before, but something to keep in mind is making sure that you're dressing conservatively, you're wearing a suit. It's better to be overdressed than too casual, as we went over before. Just re-emphasizing dressing the same for the video interview, not just on the top. So you don't want to stand up and then see like, oh, wait, this person's wearing pajamas on the bottom. This is not the best look. You want to be professional throughout. So I know we went over this already, but these are just some reminders of this. And we went over this prior, but skills-based questions versus behavioral questions, situational questions, and open-ended and close-ended questions. So skills-based questions are likely related to the industry. They want to see, is your resume, is your experience really in line with this position? Would this person really be a good fit for this role? And behavioral questions we've gone over before as well, but just showing your soft skills such as like trustworthiness, your work ethic. We talked about the example with organization. Showing a concrete example just shows that you're not just saying this, you've actually done it and there's concrete evidence of it, and what shows you'll be likely to do it again too. And situational questions are a bit similar to behavioral, but more posed as like, how would you handle a situation with a difficult coworker, for example, maybe a question like that. And you could always treat it as more of a behavioral question and say, for example, I worked as part of a team and I worked with one team member who was very difficult to work with, for example. And I had to reflect and think to myself, I have a different way of working than they do, but what are some ways that we can kind of come together? And walking them through that process will show your instincts, your decision making, how you are likely to work with different kinds of people. And this will just show other qualities that they're likely looking for in a candidate and will be beneficial for you too. And as I mentioned before, open-ended and closed-ended questions. You want to make sure you're not just saying yes or no. You want to give examples for all types of questions. Any questions about interviewing? Okay. So we already went over nonverbal communication, so we can skip over that. So let's go into after the interview. So assessing your interview performance, evaluating the position, sending a thank you note, waiting, following up, and accepting a job offer. So all of these are really important to keep in mind because after the interview, you don't want to just leave them hanging. You want them to know, as they should let you know where they are at with you, you should also let them know where you are at with them, meaning you should follow up. You should, and we'll go into more depth with this right now, but you should also just not have interviews pass by without evaluating, how did I do? What questions were difficult to answer? How could I have prepared better? And how can I practice better for the next time? Learning from your mistakes, but also not dwelling on them. Again, thinking, how can I do this differently? What were questions I was not prepared for? And what can I do in upcoming interviews and my own preparation? Maybe you want to use Big Interview, for example, which we have linked in the presentation to practice your skills. And it's just important to reflect and take a step back so you'll be ready to crush your next interview. And also keeping in mind, what were your strengths? What were things you really succeeded with or succeeded at? These are things that you can also reflect positively and continue to do in the future. So reevaluating or evaluating the position itself. So thinking yourself, determining interest in the position and organization. Based on the interview, was this a position that I'd really be interested in, moving forward with? Could, for example, like, would this be a good fit, as we keep mentioning? whether you could perform the job based on the evidence gathered. If the job itself seems to be off track of what you were hoping for, or it just doesn't seem like it aligns with your interests or values, just taking the time to consider the position before taking your next steps. Sending a thank you note. So this is super important. It doesn't have to be a written thank you note, but it's great if you could. Sending an email, just addressing who interviewed you. That's also why it's always helpful to write down who interviewed you as well. Reiterating your interest in the position, the department, or the company just shows that it was not just another interview, it wasn't just another organization. Even in your thank you email or note, you could mention something specific that was discussed, something that you wanted to provide more information on, or anything really that would be relevant to for their knowledge or for their reference. So reminding them that given you don't have to, again, have this be a super long email or note, but it's really just so that they can have a face to a name and it confirms your interest too. Waiting, which it definitely can be the hardest part, but there is no way to avoid it. Making sure that you're looking for other positions. You don't want to count just on this one. Talking with a friend or an advisor or career staff if you start panicking. So you can absolutely talk to Rockefeller College Career Services with this. That being said, waiting, but not waiting too long. You likely don't want to wait more than 2 to 3 weeks, for example. Say they give you that timeline and you've said to yourself, I haven't heard back, but I'm not sure where to go at this point. You can follow up with them, of course, in an appropriate way, but also keeping in mind if they don't get back to you, even with that too, they might not get back to you for a long time, which isn't technically fair to you, but can happen. And also making sure to keep your options open. You don't want to just be looking for positions in one place or one position and just banking on that because anything can happen. So definitely it's important to stay organized as you're going through if you're interviewing at multiple different organizations, like tracking on an Excel spreadsheet or Google Sheets, like where you're at in the interview process, people you've contacted, did you send a follow-up email, did you, etc. Like just keeping track of all these details can be really helpful. And as I mentioned, follow up, sending a brief email, thanking them again, reiterating your interest, and asking them about the status of your application in the selection process. In accepting a job offer, so congratulations, you've gotten a job offer, which is awesome. That being said, going back to evaluating the offer, keeping in mind, is this position really the best fit for me? Have I done my research? Do I feel confident that I would be a good asset to this company? And also getting the offer in writing if possible. That can be, it doesn't always happen, but if it definitely is helpful just to confirm, the validity of this offer too. And it's really just determining if this is something you'd like to accept. So in your negotiating, thinking to yourself, does this salary align with what I expected? Is this appropriate? Are the benefits what I had hoped for? Just further begging the question, is this the best fit for me? And negotiating as desired. If, you are very interested, but the salary is a little less than you'd like, things like that. These are also conversations you can have in practice with the Rockefeller College Career Services office in this interview process. And accepting and declining a job offer. So for either one, you want to do it as soon as possible. So that being said, as we've mentioned with accepting a job offer, you don't want to just accept a job offer without further, taking the time evaluating if it is the best fit for you. But if you do know it is, definitely don't wait around. Let them know. It is a serious commitment, though, however, as I keep mentioning. So it is not acceptable generally to reverse your decision. So if you've accepted a position, you really should not be saying, okay, actually, I didn't consider these factors, because that is not a good look for you or for, to them, because they're not going to be happy as they've invested time and resources into you as well. So, and also it is okay to, before accepting a job offer, to let them know I'm waiting to hear about other offers, and they can take that with what they will. If they say, nope, we want somebody right now, we want somebody that only wants us, maybe you're not the best fit, and that's okay. But being honest, being clear with potential employers really goes a long way, because it will show your communication style as an employee, if you decide to, go with them. And it also just never hurts to not burn bridges if you'd ever need to contact them for anything else in the future. It's always great to keep them in your professional network too. So in a positive way. And same thing with if you do decide to decline the job offer. That is something where doing it as soon as possible also helps. You don't want to leave them hanging. Big Interview is a great resource you can practice with. It is available to all UAlbany students. Access it through the Career Services website using a single sign-on. Practice common interview questions and industry-specific questions. It gives you the option to record your interviewing or your interviews for practice that you can review, and that can really help you prior to doing an actual interview. Some more resources here to help you: career handbooks, virtual career series on YouTube, where this will also be posted, Rockefeller College Careers website, Handshake, Rock Your Careers newsletter, and anytime you're receiving, and again, just to emphasize, the interviewing handbook too, within the career handbooks is something I would absolutely recommend viewing. That is on our website here, where you would access the career handbooks and other resources. We have this as a digital copy and printed as well. Any final questions? No? All right. So thank you so much for being here today. We really appreciate it. And if you have any questions, if you'd like to set up an appointment, you can do that via Handshake, and also contact us during our, whether it's via email, or we have our general phone number listed here, and we have our office hours listed on through email as well.